Afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome to our fringe event, The Forgotten Right, Freedom of Religion or Belief. We have got two wonderful panelists here, which I will introduce in a minute. But very quickly, let me just go through the running order. So we are going to have 10-minute contribution from each speaker in turn. Then we will have got questions from the floor. And can I ask you, please put your questions into the Q&A function. There is also a chat function, and I know the chat function is always a very lively discussion, sometimes away from what happens in the main room. But please don't forget to put your interesting thoughts and contributions, not just questions, into the Q&A section, so that we can actually have a very full discussion. We will then have concluding remarks from each speaker, and we will, and then I will conclude at the very end of the afternoon. Let me first of all thank you to the Humanist and Secularist Liberal Democrats and the Liberal Democrat Christian Forum for putting this event together. You know, we wouldn't be here unless we have our organizations within the Liberal Democrats who are making sure that fringe events and discussions happen in this form. So thank you very much to both of these organizations. Right, that brings me to the very start.
Sorry, may I just interrupt to alert people that if you are interested in either of these organizations, you can go to the exhibition and chat to them, not during this session, because we certainly are caught up in this event, but you can also go to the polls and click on the polls to enable you to sign up onto either the HSLD or the LDCF emailing lists. That's either Humanists and Secularist Liberal Democrats or the Liberal Democrat Christian Forum. And you should be able to do that at any time during this meeting. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Toby. And this is the absolute moment when I said, Toby, if I forget something, please interrupt. I hope we're going to have a full discussion and quite informal as we are as Liberal Democrats, and making sure that all voices are heard. Thank you, Toby, for reminding me. So in the poll section, you can actually sign up to the two organizations. And, you know, from other Lib Dem groups, I know how wonderful it is to be part of our groups within the Liberal Democrats. So please take advantage of that offer and sign up. There will be throughout the year, not just during conferences, some fantastic events that discussion forums that you can join and be part of. So, but now, without further ado, I want to introduce Marguerite Ohan, who's going to start us off. Marguerite is the Parliamentary Officer for CVS, or Christian Solidarity Worldwide, a human rights organization advocating for the rights to freedom of religion or belief for all. She has an MSc in Latin American politics with a focus on Cuba, and was a parliamentary researcher for Joe Swinson. And I remember Margaret well on our corridor. So it's a great pleasure to see you, Margaret. Over to you. You have about 10 minutes.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be speaking to everyone here this afternoon. So I wanted to start us off by just talking about freedom of religion or belief, or FORB, as we like to call it in the industry, within the global human rights framework. So freedom of religion or belief is a universal and fundamental human right enshrined in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in other international treaties. So Article 18 reads, "Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance." So as a universal human right, individuals, organizations, and governments have a duty to uphold this right on a national and international level. So the UN Human Rights Committee describes religion or belief as theistic, non-theistic, and atheistic beliefs, as well as the right not to profess any religion or belief. So now we kind of understand broadly what this right might mean. I think that the right to freedom of religion or belief is really bound up with a lot of other really crucial human rights. So as part of a lack of respect for freedom of religion or belief, governments will often also violate Article 19, which is freedom of opinion and expression, and Article 20, which is freedom of peaceful assembly and association. So an example of something like this would be on the 21st of June of this year, an atheist blogger called Anas Hussein appeared before a court in Alexandria in Egypt, charged with defaming religion and the misuse of social media and managing a Facebook page for Egyptian atheists. And he was sentenced to 3 years in prison and received a fine of 300,000 Egyptian pounds, which is approximately 15,000 British pounds sterling. However, in the most extreme cases, the treatment of religious or belief minority groups can reach the level of atrocity crimes and can violate human rights, including Article 3, which is life, liberty, security of person, and Article 4, freedom from slavery, and Article 5, which is freedom from torture. So I think something that I'm sure a lot of you will have seen news about is the situation of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang in China. So the Uyghurs are a ethnic minority group, but the majority of them profess the Muslim faith. And in Xinjiang, over 1 million Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and members of other ethnic groups have been detained in re-education camps since 2017 without charge. Most of the detainees are Muslim, and there is a strong religious element to the detentions. Numerous reports of torture and ill treatment, systematic rape, and forced sterilization have emerged from the camps, where conditions are dangerously sanitary and overcrowded. And there are credible reports that the Uyghurs are being exploited for slave labor. Xinjiang accounts for almost a fifth of global cotton production, and it is virtually certain that many of these goods are tainted with forced labor. According to a BBC report, hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs and other minorities are being forced into hard manual labor in the vast cotton fields in Xinjiang, and cotton picking is being used to re-educate Uyghurs. So groups of cotton pickers are being, accompanied by party officials who are actively implementing thought education during cotton picking. So it's, a really bad situation. Another ongoing situation, which is on the level of atrocity crimes and may even reach the threshold for genocide, which is how many people consider the situation in Xinjiang, is the plight of Christians in North Korea. So there are multiple reports of Christians being tortured and murdered for their faith, and North Korean escapees give accounts of them facing far more brutal treatment than other prisoners while in prison. A former North Korean prison guard recounts being instructed that Christians were reactionaries, and there were lots of instructions and mottos to wipe out the seed of reactionaries. The title of this event today is The Forgotten Right, and I think that sometimes FORB is forgotten. People assume that FORB is less important than other rights, but many view their faith as a really fundamental part of who they are and are willing to face extreme hardship, even death, rather than abandon their faith. One of the cases we work on at CSW is a young woman called Leah Sharabu, who was part of a large group of schoolgirls who were kidnapped in Nigeria, and she has been a slave for the past few years because she refuses to renounce her Christian faith. And because of this, her captors, who are part of a Boko Haram splinter group, said that she will be a slave for life for refusing to renounce her Christianity. From a more secular context, I think we sometimes forget how integral one's religions or beliefs can be to people's sense of identity and things like that. But it is really crucial that this right is protected. I think sometimes, it's called the forgotten right, but we must not forget these people who are suffering. So one of the recent developments is the impact that COVID-19 has had on religion or belief minorities. So I think, the news that we saw in the West was about some Western leaders saying that not being allowed to have mass gatherings was a violation of their right to freedom of religion or belief. But, as long as this was justified on public health grounds and not applied in a discriminatory way, this isn't actually a violation of that right. However, COVID actually really did exacerbate the situation in some countries where the Forbes situation is already quite problematic. Ahmed Shahid, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, pointed out that the pandemic has caused a flare-up in existing religious intolerance in many countries. I am alarmed to see the upsurge in incitement to hatred, scapegoating religious or belief communities, including Christians, Jews, and Muslims, for the spread of the virus. And he pointed out the duty of governments to combat misinformation about COVID-19 and religious minorities. So an example of how this might look is we see faith groups who are trying to offer humanitarian aid during this very difficult pandemic being censored for this. And we also see very stigmatizing rhetoric about religious groups. So an example would be in India. We heard about cases of Christians who were delivering aid falsely being accused of conversion under India's controversial anti-conversion legislation. And in one case, a group of Christians accused of conversion was taunted, humiliated, and detained by local police. Muslims were also targeted as a perceived source of COVID-19, and in many cases were denied medical treatment as a result of this rhetoric. CSW had cases of Muslim women about to give birth being turned away from hospitals, and Muslims who were distributing aid to migrant workers being who were trapped by the lockdown, being beaten by local leaders of the BJP, which is the ruling political party in India. So I wanted to finish this off just by talking a little bit about India. I think it's maybe not one of the first countries we think of when we talk about human rights or about freedom of religion or belief, but actually the situation there has deteriorated. I think it's important to talk about because, India is sometimes referred to as the largest democracy, and certainly in a post-Brexit Britain, it's been pointed to as a country that we can have as a close ally. We have a long historic relationship with India. There's a large diaspora community here, but unfortunately, since the election of the BJP in 2015, we have seen a growth in Hindu nationalism, which has also empowered an increasingly violent strain of Hindu nationalism. There has been a shrinking space for civil society. So in September 2020, the human rights organization Amnesty International was forced to halt its operations in the country due to reprisals from the government and accused the government of pursuing a witch hunt against human rights organizations. And a local monitoring group called United Christian Forum, UCF, estimated that 279 cases of targeted violence against Christians were reported in 2020, 4 of which were fatal. We're also seeing Muslim minority groups also facing a lot of targeting and harassment. So I think in conclusion, I just wanted to say, the Liberal Democrats have a proud history of standing up for human rights and for those facing injustice. And I think that needs to include those who are religious or belief minorities. I think that there are so many people around the world being persecuted for their beliefs, and there is also a religious element to so many of the conflicts we see today. So I think that to have a truly human rights focused foreign policy, we cannot forget the right to freedom of religion or belief. So thank you.
Thank you, Marguerite. Yeah, I think the rise in intolerance is one of our biggest political dangers, and I think intolerant governments or intolerant groups just use anything, including religion or using religion. I often find, and that includes, and I count myself as a Christian, that includes very extreme Christian views that become very intolerant. So. As a Christian myself, at the core of my belief is tolerance. Accept my neighbor as he, she, they are, and we all need to sort of get better and stronger at this, and really going into depth of where we draw our red lines, but where we always say, this is what I believe, this is my faith, that's my religion, that's my belief, but I cannot assume and I cannot impose that on others. Emma, I see you are nodding and agreeing, which is nice. Thank you. We are very happy to hear from you. Let me just introduce you, Emma. Emma Wadsworth-Jones is the Humanist at Risk Coordinator of Humanist Internationals and their point of contact with the EU Temporary Relocation Platform. Before this, Emma worked as a casework manager at Penn International, where she gained 7 years experience in devising strategies to support individuals at risk in Asia and organizing tailored training in principal, digital and physiological psychosocial security. Sorry about this. I think Penn is known to me because one of our sons worked for Penn while he was a student.
Oh, really?
And so I remember that it was very thought-provoking work that he did as a student while he was also supporting Penn. Emma, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for coming to this event.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be able to join you and to share a humanist perspective on the issue. In addition to my work on Humanists at Risk, I should say also that I'm responsible in the organisation for editing and producing the Freedom of Thought report, which examines the record of each state in upholding the rights of the non-religious. And I also am the coordinator of the End Blasphemy Laws Coalition. So a sort of a range of experience that I can bring to bear today. Unfortunately, 10 minutes isn't very long, so I will try and be concise, but should you have any questions, please do ask. There are so many cases that I could bring up to highlight different things. So if I don't mention them now, I'm very happy to in a bit. As Marguerite quite rightly mentioned, freedom of religion or belief, as envisaged by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, includes the non-religious. The UDHR itself is accepted as customary law at this point, and the ICCPR, given that it's been signed by, I believe, at least 173 of 193 states, has also entered into the realm of customary international law, which means that there aren't really exemptions. I noticed there was a question in the chat, so I thought I'd make that plain. FORB itself offers protection to individuals, not to religions or institutions. And General Comment 22 of the Human Rights Committee does go further, emphasising that the right has to be broadly construed. And that it isn't limited to traditional religions or to religions and beliefs with institutional characteristics or practices that are analogous to traditional religions. So in summary, the right to FORB protects us all, which is important because we are all a minority somewhere, and so will likely face persecution as a result. As we like to say, a person's freedom of religion or belief ends where discrimination against another begins. The right to FORB is also enshrined in other international treaties and national legislation. Particularly, you'll find it in a nation's constitution, but there may be differing interpretations of the breadth of protection provided in those particular instruments. And although FORB is often siloed, the right is actually closely linked to many other rights, such as freedom of expression, for example, freedom of assembly, the rights of women, the rights of the child, equality and non-discrimination, just to name a few. In fact, the status of FORB is generally quite a good indicator of the status of human rights more broadly in a country. So where you see that FORB is restricted, it tends to signal that there is a shrinking space for other rights, be they civil and political or economic, social and cultural. But where secularism is upheld, on the other hand, one tends to see a greater respect for rights more generally. Unfortunately, we often see states and other actors, such as civil society groups, using the term religious freedom. These two terms are not interchangeable. They represent divergent understandings of form. On the one hand, we have the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion, which is acceptably shortened to form, which ensures that religion, thought and belief are treated on equal footing. On the other, the term religious freedom, by excluding reference to thought or belief, suggests that the right is purely there to protect religious individuals. And that binary excludes humanists, atheists, freethinkers, other non-religious individuals and groups, and it's completely antithetical to the nature of FORB as it's enshrined in the UDHR and the ICCPR. Those who use this terminology tend to be seeking to distort and instrumentalize the right in order to undermine the rights and equality of others, or to challenge the universality and indivisibility of rights, instead to create a hierarchy of rights. And this particularly affects the rights of women, sexual health and reproductive rights, members of the LGBTI community, among other minorities. For those in the room today who may not be aware, humanism is a democratic and ethical life stance that affirms human beings have the right and responsibility to give meaning and shape to their own lives. It isn't theistic. I work to support a range of individuals, be they humanist, atheist, rationalist, secularist, agnostic, freethinker, among others, however they might define themselves, who are facing persecution as a result of their non-belief and or promotion of humanist values. So there are times where we take up cases of individuals who might be religious, but because of their promotion of humanist values, we will fight for them too. We know from our research and experience with humanists at risk that discrimination against them is pervasive. You can see this in our Freedom of Thought report. It's online, fot.humanists.international, where you'll see every single country in the world and what is going on in that country. The discrimination against them is also specific to the non-religious. So humanists and the non-religious are a distinct minority within FORB, and that's really important for people to understand. Members of our community are often persecuted when they say what they believe, when they defend human rights of themselves or others, or when they criticize issues of traditional or religious practice. For example, Indian rationalist Narendra Nayak, who is forced to live under 24-hour police protection as a result of his advocacy against harmful superstitious practices in India. Humanists are often at the forefront of advocacy for human rights and are targeted as a result. The non-religious more generally face a range of obstacles, from discrimination, bullying, ostracism, which might be within the family unit, in the home, or it could be from the outside world, from the state or non-state actors. In certain countries, such as Indonesia or the Maldives, atheists aren't recognized, and as such, their rights as citizens are denied. According to our research, in 17 countries, including the likes of Lebanon and Thailand, non-religious individuals are unable to obtain employment in certain government offices. And in 10 of these countries, the non-religious are barred outright from holding positions in government. Where atheism isn't recognized, non-religious individuals may be subject to the applicable family law of the religion of their birth, rather than their current beliefs. Or they might face challenges in accessing public services or be viewed as untrustworthy. For example, this is often the case where you're required to put down your religious affiliation on forms or on your identity card, and non-religious or atheist doesn't exist, and that can affect your ability to access a bank account or any other service. Many of those who reach out to me fear blasphemy. They fear being accused of blasphemy, be that in terms of formal charges or informal. More than 60 countries across the globe criminalize blasphemy, and in some of them, the mere declaration of non-religious beliefs, i.e. that individual's exercise of their right to freedom of religion or belief, is taken as evidence of blasphemy and used to prosecute them. Blasphemy is punishable in 7 countries at least with death, and in other countries where the legal sanction isn't death, non-state actors may take matters into their own hands, such as Al-Shabaab in Somalia. In some countries, the legislation varies depending on what state you live in or the religion that you hold. So, for example, if I take Nigeria, blasphemy is considered as a misdemeanor, punishable by up to 2 years in prison under customary law, which is applicable across the country in every state. However, in 12 northern states, they maintain parallel legal systems where customary international law runs parallel with Sharia law, which is only applicable to the Muslims in the community. Under Sharia law, blasphemy is punishable by death. So you can have people in northern states in Nigeria, such as Kano, for example, where one person, because they aren't Muslim, is charged with a 2-year sentence, where a Muslim might face the death penalty. And then where both, if they aren't given the death penalty and do manage to be released at some point, may face vigilante violence and be killed by others on the outside. And that's the thing, lots of people, the reason they reach out to me is because they are afraid of vigilante violence. Another example is Mashal Khan, who was killed in Pakistan in 2017 after declaring that he was a humanist on Facebook. A mob of some 30 of his fellow peer students came to his room and beat him and shot him to death. Others, such as Cypriot artist and teacher George Gabriel, may face the loss of employment because of accusations of blasphemy. George Gabriel is currently under investigation by the Ministry of Education because several individuals have filed complaints against him for his artwork that he published on his personal Facebook account. So not to do with his work as a teacher in a high school, but in his professional context as an artist, which is separate. And he is facing possible dismissal from teaching at school because some of his artworks, which include depictions of Jesus riding a motorcycle or Jesus naked, as blasphemous. Others who might face blasphemy include critics of the instrumentalization of religion, or secularists, many of whom I could list later and talk to you about have faced either the death penalty or remain in prison today. All of this contributes to a climate of fear which leads to self-censorship. And this results in significant damage to the mental well-being of members of our community. In the last 18 months, I've had around 300 requests for assistance from individuals across the globe, the majority of whom are seeking to flee their situation and claim asylum so that they can live a life that's true to their values. Unfortunately, this won't be possible for many of them because of the lack of understanding of the true extent of the right to FORB and that it does extend to the non-religious. So what we find is that individuals who are seeking asylum because of persecution for their non-religious beliefs are told that they should just return home. They can be safe at home because they don't have to manifest their belief. So they can just pretend and be safe. Now, this is entirely contrary to international law, which defines FORB as being inclusive of the non-religious and includes non-traditional manifestations of religion or belief. We have had some success in challenging this, but unfortunately the rejection of asylum cases is much higher than we've managed to challenge so far. An example of when this has worked is the case of Afghan atheist and humanist Joseph Moradi, who spent 6 years appealing his asylum claim in Norway. He has finally been granted asylum this year, and in addition, the Norwegian government have amended their guidelines on the assessment of asylum claims based on FORB, so that the non-religious claims are treated in parity with their religious counterparts.
Thank you, Emma. Can you, I know you're very, very passionate and telling us many, many interesting examples. And I'm sorry, I'm stopping you sort of mid-flow.
Don't worry.
If you're sort of starting to come to an end of your opening remarks, and then we might open the forum for questions and answers. Sorry to interrupt.
No, don't worry at all. We've had success as well in Greece and New Zealand, but we're seeking to challenge rulings elsewhere. Essentially, I could raise lots of cases with you and lots of issues with you, but it's very difficult to sum it up in 10 minutes. So I hope that I'll get to explore some of this with you in the conversation as it develops further.
Thank you, Emma. And again, apologies for interrupting.
Not at all.
I'm trying to sort of get a conversation going amongst ourselves, you know, of all the issues that you've been raising. And there's, of course, very much the issue around persecution of anybody who just doesn't have a belief. I'm sure this was very interesting to hear for our audience. But then, of course, there's the issue of how do we then deal in countries who want to give asylum to people who are suffering persecution, and how we are dealing with asylum applications. And I think that is definitely a very interesting thought, and particularly now that we are looking at what is going to happen in Afghanistan, I assume this becomes incredibly relevant, as many people are trying to flee Afghanistan. And what can we do as a third country? Indeed, what can one do to uphold human rights across the globe, where clearly countries don't want to stick to them? And that takes me to the first question from Martin Cooper, and I hope I'm understanding this correctly. Is Article 18 applicable to all countries that sign up to the Human Rights Declaration, or can countries opt out of this article? Emma, you're probably best placed to answer that question.
Yes, it's now accepted as customary international law. The UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is customary international law, as is the ICCPR. So even if a state hasn't actually ratified the ICCPR, they are now basically held to all of the articles contained within. And because FORB is customary international law, you can't make an objection to it on the basis of religious grounds, for example. However, you might find, for example, the Convention on Discrimination Against Women, the elimination of discrimination against women, many of the objections there are based on religious grounds. So they might object to very specific articles, which then they say, well, because of the religious sensitivities in our country, or because we are a whatever nation, we object to this article, or we interpret it in such a way.
And here lies the difficulty, I suspect. I mean, interpretation is then always the big question, and the tightness of how you actually formulate your legislation is always a big question. John Cole is asking, and I think I'll direct this to Marguerite. Is there a case for a written constitution which enshrines freedom of worship and belief in the UK? Marguerite, can you unmute yourself?
I was going to say, I don't believe that the UK has a written constitution. So I suppose no. Is there a case for one? Well, I think, you know, in the UK, I think we have this sort of informal constitution of rights that we sort of broadly assume that we have, which are in line with international human rights law and things like that. I mean, I'm not an expert in the law. I know that there are cases for and against the UK having a written constitution, the way the Americans have their Bill of Rights, and I can't really comment. I think that definitely I would assume that, you know, the UK falls under all the international human rights decrees on this issue. So I don't think it's necessarily necessary in this country, but I feel like, yeah, I'm not a legal expert, so there is possibly someone who could give a far more informed and knowledgeable answer on this than me.
Well, and I keep saying that because I prefer to have all the questions and comments in the Q&A section. Maybe some people have an opinion on that, and please put it in the chat because we are here to discuss the issue. So is there a case for a written constitution? Well, generally, or particularly because we need to enshrine freedom of worship and belief in the UK. If you ask me, I think there is a case for a written constitution, whether we actually need to enshrine freedom of worship and belief in the UK as a specific right. It's indeed a question that we should maybe bring out in this afternoon. The question is whether we really think that the freedom of worship and belief in the UK is threatened, and I would need an example where that is threatened. But I don't want to dominate the debate here because I'm in the chair. I'm reading out questions and making some suggestions. Mary Reid asked, can you fill us in on the Lib Dem policy on this issue? And I suspect the best person to answer that question may be Toby himself.
Right, well, yes. There are general references to freedom of religion and belief and freedom of expression, which pop up everywhere. On Monday, we will be debating whether to change the constitution, the preamble of the party constitution, so that instead of the preamble listing among those things that should not be the subject of discrimination and privilege, instead of it being religion, it will become religion or belief. That's a very general, high-level view, but it tends to inform party policy all the way down. So it is actually quite an important change, and we've been working for that for years now. I'm very happy about it. In 2015, we passed a policy, freedom of expression in Europe and beyond, which covered various things, including particularly blasphemy law. And I don't know how easy it would be to find that. People can ask me to provide it if they like by emailing chair@hsld.org.uk. I shall be happy to provide that, and I'll try to find where it's available online as well. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any other particular instances, but we try to make sure the party is always aware of the issues of freedom of expression and freedom of religion and belief.
Thank you, Toby. And well, that's a great offer. And Mary, don't forget to join the session. Toby, remind me, when is it? On Monday, did you say? You're muted? Anyway, we can put that in the chat.
Yes, I'm back. It is at 2:50 on Monday. Only 15 minutes, 2:50 to 3:05 p.m.
Thank you. NASA is asking, what do you see the major obstacles in someone achieving escape to the UK in terms of its asylum law and process for the people being persecuted for the minority faith or lack of faith in other countries? Shall I read this out again? And it's probably directed at Emma. What do you see are the major obstacles in someone achieving escape to the UK in terms of its asylum law and processes for the people being persecuted for the minority faith or lack of faith in other countries?
Well, I think one obvious thing would be our current policies around individuals being able to get to the country in the first place. So, and the current attempts even to follow an Australian route, perhaps, of a Manus Island style detention system for people who travel by boat, which would be illegal under international law, as has already been shown by the Manus Island situation. I think that when it comes to individuals seeking to claim asylum, no matter for what reason, coming to the UK is a challenge. When it comes to how you get here, obviously you require a visa to get to the UK. If you're flying, the reason that most people come in boats is because if you fly, the airline is now responsible for ensuring that you have an appropriate visa to come. And if not, they are fined. substantially. So whereas once the onus was on the border agencies making sure that someone had a right to come, and so you could get to the border and then claim asylum, you can't do that anymore on a flight, which means that people are forced to travel via boat more often than not. So there's that issue. But also I think that it is again an issue of understanding of rights, of an understanding of persecution. Something that I'd really love to see is what is being done in other countries such as Switzerland or in France as well, which is where they have essentially a humanitarian visa or a visa for someone to come and claim asylum. So that it's clear that that's what they're planning on doing, but they've applied for it and they're given it. I have cases where they've been given a visa in order to get to France in order to claim asylum. And I think that that's such a wonderful, powerful thing that we could really, really benefit from. I'm working on a lot of cases in Afghanistan at the moment, and I have very little hope for many of them. I fear that for most of them, wherever they end up, if they end up in neighbouring countries, they will be hostile to their non-religious beliefs, and they'll be afraid to disclose that being the reason that they're fleeing. And if they make it elsewhere, they may or may not be taken seriously. So it's a real concern globally, not just within the UK, but I would say that one thing I'd love to see in the UK would be some kind of visa to claim asylum.
Mm-hmm. Do you think this is impossible under the current government? I mean, we are seeing more and more draconian legislation going through, and it's absolutely heartbreaking to see what the government is doing with its new immigration and borders bill. And we have been raising big concerns again and again, but the Tories have got a big majority. And then to add insult to injury, you read in the BBC, MPs have voted too. Well, I didn't vote to do that, yeah? So if only the press would be a little bit more discerning to say, well, Tory MPs have voted to do this. We, the opposition, Liberal Democrats, Labour, often are on the same page, but particularly when it comes to human rights, we are the first to say no to restricting our until now tolerant attitude towards immigration and refugees. But it's getting worse and worse, and I get very angry. And Emma, I wonder, how much can you actually do from your organization to point that out time and again? Because when we are approaching the press, they'd say, "Oh, the Liberal Democrats," they would say that, wouldn't they? Maybe you as a non-party political organization can do more.
Yeah, and that's something that we would like to do more of. Certainly, as the international organisation, really, we don't tend to interfere in local, national issues. We ask our members to be the ones to lead that lobbying. Humanists UK do a lot of work with individuals who are seeking asylum on the basis of non-religious belief once they're in the country. They're absolutely fantastic at it. What I would really love to do in the future is coordinate a global campaign around this issue, so that our members across the globe are petitioning everyone so that we can see the right to FORB fully realised and fully understood.
Marguerite, how much do you feel that your voice from your organization has actually been heard? Of course, you're all doing wonderful work, and the question for me is always, how much is this publicly known in a world that, I think becomes increasingly intolerant, and the press is just sort of following?
I think that, sometimes it can be seen as a more niche issue. I think sometimes people are a little bit less interested in it, which is a real shame, because I think it's actually an incredibly crucial human rights issue. I mean, one also has to think, you have the government, but then you also have, kind of the Tories, so you have, the Foreign Office, things like that. I think it varies. I think that, I, in my role with the kind of experts that I work with at CSW, who all kind of focus on different areas, we meet with different Foreign Office desks fairly frequently, and I think that some desks are, so in the Foreign Office you'll have the desk on Russia, the desk on Myanmar, the desk on wherever. So we'll meet with different kind of country desks, and they also actually do have a specific department focused just on freedom of religion or belief. But we'll meet with different desks, and I think it really depends. I think some desks are very receptive to our concerns and are on the same page with us. Others, I think, do kind of underestimate the religion or belief implications in the countries that they're doing. I know that one of the areas where we kind of rub up against the Foreign Office is our interpretation of the Pharma herder conflict in Nigeria. We think that there is a strong religious element to this, and the Foreign Office tends to see it more as a kind of environmental resource focused conflict. But if you actually look at things like the attacks on churches and places of worship, on kind of faith leaders and things like that, I think it becomes really quite clear that there is a strong religious element to this conflict. And hopefully the Foreign Office will eventually agree with us on this, but who knows?
Well, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I hear it, I think, through open doors, and, you know, there's always statistics floating around, but Christians across the world are the most persecuted religious group. Is that correct?
Yes. So I think the Bishop of Truro, he did a big report for the government on this issue, and that was found to be the case. I think also, to be fair, though, Christians are also the largest religious group, so I'm not sure how that kind of tallies out, but yes, that is the case. So the Bishop of Truro report focused on the persecuted Christians, but actually the way it the conclusions it ended up coming to was basically just that we need stronger protections for freedom of religion or belief across the board, not just Christians. So CSW, the organization I work for, we originally were a organization focused on persecuted Christians, but we now focus on all groups who are being persecuted for their religion or belief. We agree with Emma. We think it's important that we use religion or belief, not just religious freedom. We take our duty as an organization that now advocates for all quite seriously, and try to be, quite balanced in that. And I know that our founder, the reason he kind of switched over is because he was advocating for the Christians in Myanmar, and he said, to me it just seemed ridiculous to be advocating just for the Christians in Myanmar when the situation started happening with the Rohingyas. You couldn't not talk about what was happening with the Rohingya in Myanmar. And for him, in the Bible you have there's the story of the Good Samaritan, and the idea of you must help your neighbor. Who is my neighbor? Everyone is my neighbor. I really liked Emma's comment about everyone is a minority somewhere. I think that if you value your own faith, you should respect how other people value their religion or belief, and you should stand up for their right to do so, free from fear.
Thank you, Marguerite. Actually, that leads us quite nicely into the question from Philip. Statistically, do we know the world is getting less tolerant? Is there any measure for that? Is there a tolerance measure? You're both looking at.
I'm not an expert on this. I've definitely seen studies focused on certain contexts. I'm not sure if there has been a global study on this. I think it would be something that would be very hard to study. It certainly feels that way, but perhaps that is just my pessimism speaking. I do think that there are issues that have been studied to do with things like social media echo chambers, which can create a lot of polarization, things like that. And, as the world becomes increasingly online, I think that those problems are getting worse. But I could not point you to a statistic or a study, though I would encourage you to do so if you have the capability, because I think it would be very interesting to see.
Thank you, Marguerite. Now, Jackie, hi, Jackie. I can't see you, but it's good to see you in the audience. How do we balance rights between, say, women's rights and certain extremist religions who deny those rights as an article of faith? Should human rights come before religious rights? Marguerite.
Well, I think, again, this question kind of shows, I think, one of the problems with the right to freedom of religion or belief, which is this idea that there is a dichotomy between human rights and the right to freedom of religion or belief, when the right to freedom of religion or belief is an incredibly intrinsic and important and indivisible human right. And I think that actually there is a lot of intersection between violations of the right to freedom of religion or belief and violations to the rights of, for example, women and girls. I know that we have a report due to come out soon about how Mexican women face violations to their rights to freedom of religion or belief, and things like rights to education. You know, we've seen contexts. So one of the countries that people are sometimes surprised that we work on is actually Mexico. And I use this example just because I was talking with my colleague about this earlier this week. In some of these very rural communities in Mexico, if families, you know, maybe convert away from whatever the majority religion is within their community, they can actually face a lot of discrimination. We've seen examples of families being kind of stripped of their communal land rights. We saw one family where their water supply was cut off from the village, and their children may be excluded from school or may face a lot of discrimination in school, which obviously really negatively impacts on their education. I think that, you know, being a young woman, I think sometimes education can be harder to access. When you compound that with being a religious minority, it's very difficult. Another issue we see, for example, and there are many issues of this, I could give many examples for this, but another issue we see is, for example, in Pakistan, you have young girls who are from a religious minority group, for example, Hindu or Christian, who are married to much older Muslim men, and then, you know, even though this is illegal, this is underage marriage, if they try and return to their families, they can face, you know, accusations of blasphemy and things like that. It can be very, very dangerous and difficult for them to try and escape from what is, you know, essentially, you know, grooming and kidnapping and things like that, you know. So yeah, I think there is no dichotomy between human rights and freedom of religion or belief. It is an intrinsic human right. And I think that, you know, yes, in some countries, I think that there is a religious justification given for violating human rights. But obviously I disagree with that. So
yeah, so I mean, I couldn't agree more. Again, I sort of take this right from the chair, but to set up the two against each other, I think would be an absolute rabbit hole to go down.
But it often is the case.
Yeah,
it often is the case, and you do see violations of sexual health and reproductive rights, for example, women's rights, LGBTI rights, often on the basis of religious freedom or traditional family values, often given as a reason. But international human rights law has a very clear framework for this. It may be interesting for some of you, particularly Jackie, who asked this question. We produced a guide on freedom of religion or belief, the Good Practice Guide, and this talks about this here. But essentially, firstly, you have the principle of non-discrimination, so that no right to discriminate against any particular minority on any grounds, regardless of whether it's religious or otherwise. Human rights are indivisible and non-hierarchical, so they're all on the same level, and they shouldn't be treated as if they're in competition with each other. One right can't be sacrificed for another right. There should also be the principle of neutrality and impartiality, so of the state between religions and non-religious forms of belief. Pluralism and tolerance is another principle that's important, which also entails the acceptance that there is no right not to be offended. And proportionality in determining whether an interference in the right to manifest one religion or belief is justified. Certain elements of FORB are are liable to restrictions. The internal isn't. The personal held belief, that's inalienable. Nothing can affect that. However, the public manifestation can be restricted under certain circumstances. It has to be prescribed by law, for example, and be reasonable and proportional. So there are times where you can discuss this, and there is a whole framework around making these decisions, but essentially all rights are equal. You should not be able to, and under international law you aren't able to and should not be using religious exceptionalism to undermine the rights of others.
Thank you, both of you. I mean, my thing is very often as a women's rights campaigner, when the issue of abortion, for example, comes along, I get a lot of constituents who come to me and say that as a Christian, the sanctity of life, same when we talk about assisted dying, we actually just passed a motion on assisted dying, which I think is very much on humanitarian grounds, and it doesn't conflict. It doesn't conflict with my faith. But for some people, I know this can be often, quite become a conflict. But I sometimes wonder whether religious belief is just sort of taken out, certainly in extremist views, and when it comes to countries like let's say Afghanistan, where just people are defending a tradition and a culture and use religion and faith as an argument, and that's where I get quite angry, because it sort of undermines the faithful as well, who don't necessarily who call themselves faithful like I do, but look at many of these arguments of just men trying to continue to uphold old-fashioned and reactionary views. That's my personal belief. I put this out here. Stuart is asking, I have missed most of the debate so far. Questions on apostasy. Which countries make it a crime? In which is the theoretical penalty death? In which is the death penalty carried out? I suspect that's Emma again, but Marguerite, have you got anything to add to that? I'm not sure if Emma can. Maybe she can. I'd be very impressed, but I'm not able to reel off a list of all the countries which apply capital punishment for apostasy. But I do know that it can be an incredibly problematic thing. One of the examples I used earlier was these young Pakistani girls from religious minority groups who are victims of these kind of forced child marriages. Then if they try and return to their families, can face accusations of apostasy, which makes it very difficult for them. I think in a lot of these, very theocratic, conservative countries, apostasy can be something that's very penalized. And I think it's not just the governments which are the problem. For example, in Pakistan, sometimes these girls' rights are actually upheld by the courts because they do have laws against child marriage and things like that. And kind of extremist groups within their community may then try and execute them. So it can be a legal issue, but it can also be something to do with societies and extremist groups. So, yeah. I can currently not see any more questions or comments in the Q&A box. Toby, I now sort of wonder whether you have got a question to the panel.
Yes. Earlier on, Emma talked about religious freedom as opposed to freedom of religion or belief. And I don't think Margarita has commented on that. I'll be very interested to hear her take. I suspect it's not very different.
So as I said earlier, I think CSW, we do take our duty to speak out for freedom of religion or belief for all very seriously. And, we are in many different groups in which we interface with the Humanists and with other groups working on this issue. And we certainly take on board their comments about what is appropriate language to use and try and be mindful of that. There are other organizations, I think in the US, a lot of their international groups that work on it do prefer the term religious freedom. I think, as an organization, we are non-political, and we, we'll try and work with groups that share interests with us on this issue, but we personally do believe it is important to use the language freedom of religion or belief, and make sure to use that when we are out and about. Yeah.
I mean, can I add just, from my point of view, non-professional, totally personal, human rights legislation comes from a Christian sort of Western democratic tradition, I find very much. So that the two are not, that the two are not in opposition with each other, I think sort of completely works for me. There is, of course, at some point, the question about doctrine and how far do you believe something? And I would always say, for example, on the difficult issue of abortion, I wouldn't, I could have known. We've got 4 children, and we had the issue of whether there was the reason why I needed to have an abortion medically, and I could never have aborted a child, and that is for me. But another woman, another family comes to a different conclusion, and I find I cannot make that judgment and that decision for another person. And with all my strong faith in that I wouldn't want to do that myself, I think I have to draw the line of where I impose my belief on somebody else. And I know it's difficult, but I think ultimately, the tolerance that we live as liberal democrats does not have to exclude to be a person of faith. But I think people of faith need to develop that tolerance towards people who do not have that faith. And I think this discussion is incredibly, or this forum is incredibly useful and important to sort of really deeply think about, where this rubs, where faith and liberalism rubs. As I say, for me personally, it's not a conflict, but I know sometimes it is a conflict for people. I'm trying to sort of see whether there are any more questions or answers. I see that Christopher answered in the Q&A in the chat function, and I knew that this would happen. That the chat function has got its own discussion going. That. From Wikipedia, apostasy is a crime in Afghanistan, Brunei, Iran, Malaysia, 6 out of 13 states, Maldives, Mauritania, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Yemen. Emma, we didn't actually bring you in for that question about where it is a crime. Do you want to quickly add to that?
There are currently, according to our research, 17 countries where apostasy is criminalized. It could be apostasy as in going from religion to none, or it could be going from one religion to another. Both are seen as apostasy. There are 11 countries, as far as I'm aware, that punish apostasy with death. You can find them on the Freedom of Thought report rather than me listing them for you now for the sake of time. Yes,
and I mean, there's a very rich discussion going on in the chat discussion. And Kathy, for example, says, sometimes Christians suffer at the hand of Christians of their own denominations, and that is true too. It is in some parts of the Church of England, it is quite difficult if you're LGBT plus. And I mean, we are going through the difficult issues about conversion therapies. But I must say that quite a lot of religious leaders have come out and spoken out against conversion therapies. But that also falls straight into the discussion that we are having here. How far do you go in praying for somebody who goes through the difficult issues of identity and who they belong, their sexuality, and I think yes, the Church of England and other religious organizations still have to answer themselves some very deep and difficult questions, because it is about allowing people to be themselves. And if anything, we Liberal Democrats stand up for the right of people to be themselves and develop that identity and develop understanding who they are in terms of sexuality, in terms of their gender, and so on and so forth. And that goes also straight into the human rights question. And yes, we can. It's easy to condemn people outside, but I always find it is also very important to get our own house in order. We are now coming to the end of this very, very rich session, and I want to give Emma and Marguerite the opportunity to say some to make some closing remarks. Emma.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk to you and to learn also from Marguerite about the work of CSW. I think the important takeaway here is that freedom of religion or belief encompasses everyone, all beliefs. It could be none. It has been used and is used to undermine other rights, and we should all be fighting against this. No right, there is no hierarchy in rights. And I think that's where I'll leave it.
Thank you, Emma. And Marguerite?
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and it's wonderful to see you again, Wera. I just wanted to say again, you know, there are so many people around the world suffering because of their religion or belief. And I think it is important to speak out for these people, to make sure that their suffering is heard. I think that, you know, it is, you know, the UK likes to hold itself up as this paragon of human rights. And I think if we're going to take that seriously, we need to take the right to freedom of religion or belief seriously too. So it can't be a forgotten right, and we mustn't forget these people.
Thank you. And Toby, maybe can I leave the very closing remarks to you?
Right. Well, as chair of Humanist and Secularist Liberal Democrats, I'd like first of all to thank the Liberal Democrat Christian Forum, which actually came up with a proposal for this meeting, which was a very good idea, and I'm glad it's been a success. As I said at the beginning of the meeting, some of the people have come in since then. You can visit our exhibition stand and their exhibition stand for the rest of conference. That's the bottom button on the left-hand tab on your screens. And if you would like to sign up to the emailing list for either organisation, there are two polls. On the right-hand side of your screen, the poll tab will take you to them. That enables you to sign up to the Liberal Democrat Christian Forum or to the Humanist and Secularist Liberal Democrats emailing list, or indeed both. And given that Humanist and Secularist Liberal Democrats include secularists who may not necessarily be humanists, you could well want to sign up to both. And I think that's about all, really. But thank you very much. Oh, and most of all, yes, thank you, Wera, for agreeing to chair this meeting with some enthusiasm, as I recall, and to Emma and Marguerite for agreeing to participate.
Yes, and the last thank you to all the participants. Thank you for your contributions. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this fringe, and I hope you're enjoying the rest of the conference.